introduce our speaker.
Okay. Well, tonight we have another joint Scholars Guild Library Guild presentation for you. The Library Guild has, as part of its mission, to encourage and promote local authors. Our speaker, Rebecca L. Davis, is a highly accomplished professor of history and of women and gender studies at the University of Delaware, as well as a prolific author. Her books include Public Confessions, The Religious Conversions That Changed American Politics, More Perfect Unions, The American Search for Marital Bliss, and a co-edited collection of scholarly essays called Heterosexual Histories. And of course, her latest book, Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America, which she is here to discuss this evening. And there are books over there. All of her books have garnered high praise and interest, called, for example, scholarly but accessible and engrossing. And if that isn't enough, she also writes a newsletter called Carnal Knowledge. Love that title. That is available for subscription on Substack. And we are indeed honored to host Dr. Davis for the first talk of this season of the Scholars Guild. Copies of her book will be available for purchase and signing after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sue and Kathleen, Jennifer, and many other people who brought me here and made this visit possible. I am delighted to be with all of you tonight. My book came out about a year ago, so I've been talking to lots of groups like this, some smaller, some larger, and really enjoying having the opportunity to share this book with different audiences. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everyone watching on Zoom or later on YouTube as well. And just, Kathleen, to put your mind at ease, I realize I've developed over the years a speech pattern of pausing a lot in the middle of sentences. And that's because I have to be very careful, especially when talking to undergraduates, not to, to Sue, actually, with the misspeaking. I have to be very careful to not trip over my words or say something that'll get me in trouble with the teenagers that I teach. So I very much recognize the struggle. All right, so I want to start by telling you a story. Over 75 years ago, a team of researchers at Indiana University published a study that challenged what people thought they knew about human sexuality. At the time of this publication in 1948, and still in many quarters today, it is one of the most controversial studies of sexuality ever published. It originated with a biology professor's search for information he could share with his students. Alfred C. Kinsey was a zoologist who studied the genetic pattern of the gall wasp. He was not a sex educator. In 1938, he was asked to teach a new marriage course at Indiana University. This was not at all uncommon. Many American universities in the 30s were introducing courses on marriage, usually taught by someone from biology or sociology. There's a whole history to why people thought they needed to start doing this, but with coeducation rising and with marriage rates declining, there was thought that academia could maybe be part of the solution. So Kinsey undertook this task the way academics tend to prepare for teaching courses. He had lectures to prepare, and he went out and looked for the research. But what he found disturbed him greatly. For one thing, he found studies that were either a single psychoanalytic case analyzed. He found reports based on perhaps 100 self-reported questionnaires of a non-representative sample. He found the work of Catherine Bebent Davis, which he really respected, but she was the only one. She's an interesting person in her own right, but largely what he found disappointed him. But in addition to the methods bothering him, Kinsey noted the values baked in to these studies, that they tended to assume there was something called normal sexuality that could be measured or ascertained or studied. And Kinsey said, as a scientist, You don't start out knowing the norm. You have to do the study first to figure out what the norm is. But also, Kinsey himself was queer. And so he understood sexuality as something that existed on a spectrum, as a point in variation. And so, this idea that there is, in fact, a normal sexuality, that kind of valuing that kind of norm bothered him as well. Students also started to come to him with questions. Now, questions about the course material, but as they got to know him and realized he was very comfortable talking about sex in any shape or form, they also started to ask him personal questions. Professor, this thing happened. Is that normal? And all he could tell them was that he had absolutely no idea, that there was no research he could look to let them know whether their desires or their behaviors or their bodily configurations existed in any sort of a statistical field. So, as his students asked him these questions, he realized he wanted to find out the answers to these questions. So, he applied to the Rockefeller Foundation and got a major grant, hired a research team, and they developed this incredible list of between 200 and 300 questions. They memorized all of the questions so that while doing these one-on-one interviews, they could maintain a relaxed posture, maintain eye contact. They memorized which questions would proceed based on the answer to the prior question. They wrote the answers down in code, usually on a single sheet of paper. Back at their offices, they had these giant Hollerith computational machines. They could feed this in, and out came data that could look at average age at first orgasm based on decade of birth, average age of first nocturnal emission based on geography or education level, likelihood of engaging in various sexual practices based on occupational category. He had data that he could work with. And this, of course, became the Kinsey Report of 1948, and subsequently the second study from 1953 on the sexual behavior in the human female, as they called it. Now, Kinsey's methods were not great. There are a lot of critiques about both his statistical sampling, his analysis. There are a lot of problems with the way he did this. For example, the study of men is based almost entirely on white men. He used a sampling method that's not terribly scientific. Okay, but nevertheless, it established that you could study human sexuality as a science. Beyond that, it established this idea, introduced this idea that human sexuality is about variation. And he was famous for his Kinsey scale, right? That from 0 to 6 of people who are entirely heterosexual or entirely homosexual, and that in fact, most people exist somewhere in between. So I mention this, and I'll come back to it at the end, because as a historian, I also decided not to assume that there was a norm. There's different ways to write a book. I was given this opportunity to write a single volume narrative history of sex and sexuality in America. Is that a linear story? Is there a single person or group of people that could get me from A to B? And I decided there wasn't. I decided to have each chapter be about different groups of people or individuals, because I found when I looked at my sources that variation was far more the rule than any sort of norm. And my hope is that by highlighting specific examples that are different and varied, we in fact gain a much better understanding of this history. Today, we face these really polarized conversations about sexuality in the United States. On the one hand, this kind of incredible New York Times Magazine story about I think like 30-person polycule in the suburbs of Boston. And on the other side, we now have the word tradwife in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So a polycule where people are in various sort of live communally, share resources, and are sexually mutual with other members of the community. And the tradwife being this sort of started on social media idea. Here we have a definition: a married woman who embraces traditional gender roles and values. This is very right wing. These women are often themselves entrepreneurs whose husbands have given up their high paying jobs in order to enable the wife to be on social media all day talking about what a traditional wife she is. There's a whole story to that. But I think that here's and there's like anyway, uh, is a whole, I'm very interested in the trad wife, but I find it peculiar. Um, but I think it shows that even today, even in our conversations about sex and sexuality in the United States today, we're kind of all over the map. You know, hear people talk about how this younger generation is actually not having as much sex as prior generations did. But then there's a lot of conversations about polyamory and open marriages. So are people having all kinds of varied sex? Are people not having very much? Are people having enough? Sex particularly procreative, or are we looking at a demographic cliff that we're going to fall off of and do we need to encourage people to have more babies? All right, so this is an endlessly fascinating topic for me, I certainly find, but I bring this up only to say that these issues continue to evolve. I hope to have the opportunity to write subsequent chapters to this book as the issues continue to change. So what I want to talk to you about tonight in sort of 3 steps is why I don't think it's useful to explain American sexuality by talking about the Puritans. I want to talk a little bit more about someone named Anthony Comstock and what he did in the 1870s and later to get the federal government involved in controlling what could be said and printed and done in terms of sexual behavior. And then I want to use that example to talk about why sexual liberation was so radical, why it was so threatening to people who opposed it, and why, in particular, women's sexuality has remained so controversial as a sort of autonomous concept. Kinsey's second book was far more controversial than his first. So, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female found rates of premarital sex and of extramarital sex that did not in any way uphold a June Cleaver image of the 1950s. And in fact, had fun tidbits like women who had sex with other women orgasmed at much higher rates than women who had sex with men. Women who had premarital sex were more likely to have orgasm during marital sex. So sort of putting, sort of taking all of the advice of the era about waiting till marriage and so on and saying, sure, but those women aren't having as much fun as the women who aren't following that advice. So, and it was very controversial. All right, so I'm going to move into the first part of this talk, which is to try to, I don't know if I'll ever succeed in this, but I'm on this mission to try to get people to stop talking about us as a Puritan nation. Because on the one hand, the Puritans don't really conform to our stereotype of what a Puritan is. So, for example, I open the book with the story of Thomas or Thomasine Hall, who lived in this little English village of where they had displaced indigenous people called Weraskayak, just up the river from Jamestown. And we know about T. Hall because they came before the General Court in Virginia around 1629 in a dispute over whether this person was a man or a woman. T. Hall had been found in bed with an indentured servant named Great Bess. Indentured servants in colonial Virginia were not allowed to get married, and they certainly weren't allowed to have premarital sex because that wasn't beneficial to the people who had paid their indentures. So was T. Hall getting away with something that the other young male indentured servants weren't allowed to do? Possibly if T. Hall was a man. On multiple occasions, members of the community forcibly examined Hall's body and reached different conclusions about whether this person was a man or a woman. And through these observations, we can think now we know about intersex people. We know about the fact that bodies are very varied. We know about androgen insensitivity disorder. We know about all kinds of differences of sexual development that mean that our bodies are, in fact, not binary male-female, but there's a great deal of variation. We don't really know from the documents what, and no one at the time would have had any of the tools to understand this. But Hall apparently during their life switched between male and female social roles. What you wore, and whether you were doing female tasks or male tasks was a big part of what gender meant. But there was no fussiness or hesitation to discuss what kind of body this person had, to have people in the community, they were women because they thought Hall was a woman, and so women would be authorized to examine another woman's body. There was no shyness about this. This was not a culture where people were hesitant to talk about sex or find out about it. And the reason Hall was ultimately declared to be both man and woman and forced to wear elements of both kinds of clothing was more about social location and shaming, because it was a question of, is this person fomenting social disorder? Are they confusing things? And you can't have that. It was a gender system very different from our own. So on the one hand, this is a patriarchal society. If we're thinking about the Puritans in New England, wives are supposed to do what their husbands, husbands are in charge of the households, children are supposed to obey their parents. At the same time, if a man went to sea and never came back and they weren't sure what happened, or if he simply had to travel for a long time, married women could be designated as effectively a deputy husband. So there were things legally that a married woman couldn't do. A married woman couldn't sign contracts on her own. She couldn't keep wages unless she was a deputy husband. And so similarly, in their spiritual languages, Puritans, I mean, we have to remember these are sort of the fundamentalist Protestants of their day. They're like this very extreme version of Protestantism from the time. But they believed that the soul was feminine, because you have to receive Christ's love, and receiving in their understanding was gendered female. To submit is to be female. So if you're submitting to Christ's love, you do so as a bride. And so Puritan ministers and faithful men wrote about how their ecstatic emotions at being penetrated by Christ's love and the piercing, sting of the reception. This is the kind of language they used. I'm not saying that I think these men were gay. That word would have absolutely no meaning to them. I don't know if any of these men engaged in sex or fantasized about engaging in sex with other men. What I'm saying is that they saw themselves as Puritan men, as having a female soul that through ecstatic experiences of Christ's love put them in the position of a bride. And nothing about that led other people in the community to doubt that these were moral and spiritually elevated men, right? It's just a completely different system. So again, in their religious worship, there's this erotic language, there is this passionate love language that was very much a part of what they did. The last thing I'll say is that the Puritans hated Catholics. And one of the things that they did to show how much they hated Catholics was glorify sex within marriage and talk about how wonderful sex was, that it is not secondary to celibacy, that it is in fact the greatest form of sex, and that this is something that husbands and wives should always enjoy together. So they were very pro-sex when it came to husbands and wives. So I don't see the Puritans as terribly anti-sex or prudish. I just think they had a system really different from ours. They also had tons of babies, and there was a lot of population growth. Flowing from this into the late 18th century, early 19th century, we see in the United States a gender system where passionate love between same-sex friends was very accepted. We see this in the letters of famous founders to their male friends. We see this in letters women wrote to one another in long friendships. Bed sharing was extremely common. Now, back in T. Hall's time, there just simply weren't very many beds. But even by the 1780s, the 1820s, if a guest came to visit, most people would have laughed at the idea of having a spare bed in their house. The guests, either the members of the household piled into a bed together, or the guests piled in with the members of the household. Bed sharing was very common. But we do find diaries and letters from this time with people talking about the incredible nights they spent in bed with their beloved friends. They talk about kissing one another. They talk about caressing one another. There are romantic descriptions of nights spent in the company of a same-sex friend. And some of these relationships went on for decades. And so one of the examples I talk about in the book is between Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus. Their letters are the only letters we've found, and there were other historians who found this, but the only letters that historians have found of queer love between two Black women in the 19th century. So Rebecca Primus came from a middle-class family in Hartford, Connecticut. Her parents were very highly regarded in their local church, and they basically ran an employment agency for other African Americans. And we think that maybe that's how they met Addie. She was self-educated, had never had any formal education. She was alone. And we think that she probably came to the Primus household to get work. They would have placed her in another home, given her a reference to go get some work. And she also, for a while, worked for a girls' school in the area. There, Rebecca saved all of the letters she got from Addie. And this is remarkable. She lived to be in her early 90s. She, after the Civil War, founded a school in Maryland for freed Blacks, and the school was later named for her because she was so beloved. She married a porter in the Connecticut Senate, which was one of the highest civil service jobs available to Black men in the state at the time. They never had any children. She married a little bit later in life. But her family was so loved that the papers ended up at the Connecticut Historical Society. But among those papers were these passionate letters from her friend, Addie Brown. And they are really extraordinary. Addie writes to her, if I had the wings of a dove, I would fly to you. I am hungry like a wolf. To be again with you. So the spelling is strange, the grammar is strange, she's completely self-taught, and yet her letters to Rebecca are incredibly passionate. You can feel the intensity. And she talks about an employer who's basically sexually harassing her and trying to kiss her. And she says, "Don't worry, Rebecca, no kisses is like yours." So we can see from the evidence that some of these friendships were in fact romantic and sexual in a variety of different ways. So this is, again, not a Puritan society. This is not an anti-sex world where people are afraid of passion happening. And in fact, Addie would come to visit and stay in the Primus house in Rebecca's bed when she was visiting. There's a great deal of evidence to suggest that Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed had a romantic friendship that lasted decades as well. There was a film that came out last summer called Lover of Men that took a look at this question. And many, many historians of sexuality believe that, in fact, the men were lovers. They shared a bed much longer than they needed to. So when Lincoln first arrived, Speed said, "Great, you can stay with me. I live upstairs." Lincoln was young and had no money. But they continued to do that for a very long time after Lincoln would have been able to rent a room with his own bed. And they write very affectionately when Speed, you know, talked about him, he talked about Lincoln very passionately and affectionately. Now, this is one of the funniest examples I've been able to find. I want to, and this is from an article by Martin Duberman from the early to mid 1980s, at the very beginning of the field of the history of sexuality. He found these letters. These guys were become Confederates. This is a picture of them as Confederate figures. When they were young men, they apparently had some fun in bed together. So Jeff Withers writes to Jim Hammond, "I feel some inclination to learn whether you yet sleep in your shirt tail and whether you yet have the extravagant delight of poking and punching a writhing bedfellow with your long fleshen pole, the exquisite touches of which I have often had the honor of feeling. Sir, you roughen the downy slumbers of your bedfellow by such hostile, furious lunges as you are in the habit of making at him, when he is least prepared for defense against the crushing force of a battering ram." So I don't know that we can read this letter and think that something sexual didn't happen between these two guys when they were in bed together. I think what's unusual about this letter is that we have it. I don't think that it's unusual. I don't think it was a rare occurrence. There was a lot of bed sharing, and there was a lot of, young women weren't respectable young women and young men wouldn't go out together, right, in the early 1800s. Sociability was usually same gender. So women spent a lot of time with other women, men spent a lot of time with other men. And there was sort of this understanding that you could have these romantic and possibly erotic experiences with your friends that ultimately you'd put aside when you got married. And in fact, there's a a case of two women where one of the women gets married, the other woman never does. The woman is married for about 3 decades, and when her husband dies, the friend moves right back in. So we see some of these friendships lasting across a lifetime. So the Puritans weren't prudes. Gender was thought about totally differently than we think about it now. And queer desire was much more part of the fabric of people's daily lives. So, men holding hands and embracing and telling each other how much they loved each other, that wasn't seen as extraordinary. And women having some sort of sex play with each other and pleasure with each other was also seen as part of girlhood and young womanhood. Um, I'll just add a footnote. Sodomy was illegal, and sodomy was written about in extremely negative terms. Very, very, very few people were arrested for it. And historians have found only 2 instances of capital punishment being carried out in sodomy cases in the entire colonial period. So we think of the Puritans as being so severe in following Old Testament law when it comes to sex. But they seem to have looked for any way to make a lesser charge. Well, maybe it was attempted sodomy, but there's only 1 witness and the law requires 2. And there's a lot of efforts to sort of step back making this a capital crime. Far more often prosecuted in the colonial era was fornication, sex with an unmarried woman. That is much more communally destabilizing. If young women who aren't married are having sex and getting pregnant, that is a real problem for a community. Some of the only sodomy trials that we see involved allegations of force. So involved also big disparities in age. If there were boys who were being preyed upon, that's more often when we see cases that show up in court records from the 1600s, 1700s, which says to me that for the most part, people were like, yeah, you do you. And as long as it's not bothering anybody else, no one's like knocking down people's doors to find out what's going on inside. That changes with the next person I'm going to talk about. So what we think of as sort of this intrusive, oppressive, Puritan outlook on sex really arrives in the United States in the 1870s in the person of Anthony Comstock. Now, for years, I've been teaching about Anthony Comstock, and I was confused. How did someone with no elected office, who most people disliked, arrogate so much power to himself that he could go to Congress and claim powers that really weren't his in a way that he could then control all of American sort of intimate decision-making? Recent history has given me new perspective on how that could occur. But Comstock was a sort of self-appointed moral policeman for the country. And that is, he had no other, he got Congress to pass this, basically the midnight hour. Most people hadn't really read it. This incredibly restrictive anti-obscenity bill. Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use. We just call it the Comstock Act. That's easier. And it's notable for a couple reasons. One is it included so many different things. So a sex education pamphlet was now obscene and illegal to send through the US mail. So it was using Congress's interstate commerce authority. But also sex toys, oil paintings in which there were female nudes, live model art classes. All of that is now considered obscene under the Comstock Act. But this is the kicker. Any drug or medicine or any article whatever for the prevention of conception or for causing unlawful abortion. Through the Comstock Act, Anthony Comstock had the US government define anything other than procreative sex between a husband and a wife as obscene. Anything involving contraception or abortion, this is now definitionally obscene. What he also got them to do was appoint him the Postmaster General. And he did not receive a government salary. He had YMCA backers in New York City who liked what he was doing, and they came up with a salary for him. But he was basically, again, just sort of uh, got himself this big job. And he would deputize local police to then be his deputies to go out and do these raids. So it was extremely onerous. And it's interesting to think about what effect the Comstock Act had on people and where it fell short. So it did not stop the trade in these goods. It ushered in a new era of euphemism. It became harder to know what exactly this pill to solve female troubles was really talking about. Um, but these items were often sold in pharmacies. Some of them were listed in the Sears catalog. There were all kinds of ways to access medications that would prevent conception, induce abortion, and so on. He did seize a ton of materials. He kept records. He would basically decide, you're selling charming postcards up front. I want to see your back storeroom, and would sort of burst through these bookstores and small shops and look at their stock in the back, want to see what was hidden under the desk. And anything that he considered obscene to his eyes, he would seize and destroy. So often these small shops were run by immigrants. So a lot of recent immigrants to the United States had their stores' stock seized. He would go after anybody he considered a pornographer and seize all of their photos. He kept records. He burned thousands and thousands of books. He celebrated all of this. He went after sex radicals in particular. So by the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, there's a whole free speech movement rising up against things like the Comstock Act. And one of the sort of most sensitive points in the free speech movement is sexual speech. And so Comstock loves to go after these people, and in fact sends people like Ezra Heywood, one of the most prolific sex radicals of the time, to a workhouse when he's in his 60s, leaving his wife, Angela Heywood, who was also a sex educator, to raise their 4 kids by herself. And by the time Heywood got out, he basically died within 6 months because his body was so broken by the experience. Comstock kept a list of all the people who died as a result of his prosecutions. There were people who committed suicide rather than go to prison. He also went after midwives and women who provided abortion care. And he was successful in harassing a lot of people either to give up this line of work or to put them in prison. And there were several cases of people that he just hounded relentlessly. And he, again, kept lists of everyone who went to prison, everyone who died. And he kept lists of the numbers and pounds of goods that he seized from people. So on the one hand, he did not succeed in stopping the flow of information, right? Information continues to flow, but it kind of goes into a black market, becomes harder to find. And it becomes harder to find someone to give you good care if you need an abortion, right? Because he pushes that further underground as well. There had been several people providing abortions in places like New York City very openly for much of the 19th century. And people who made a very good living and were known to be sort of figures about town who made their livings as providers of contraceptives and abortion care. Comstock pushed that underground. And people really despised him, right? And that was the part of it that I never quite understood until more recently. How could somebody that sort of widely disliked have that much power? But he was mocked because he was so sort of out of it and stuffy and prudish. But he continued to have this big influence. But I think Comstock is super important, not only for doing that, but for getting the government more involved in American sex lives. So it's not really the Puritans who do that. They said, look, if nobody's being harmed, if there aren't unwed mothers hanging out, we're kind of good. Like, it's okay. Comstock said, absolutely not. The government has authority to intervene here. So governing via sexuality is something that I write about in my book that I find really interesting. So one of the first pieces of federal immigration legislation in the United States was about sex work. And the Page Act of 1875 prohibited nearly all women from China from entering the country on the suspicion that they were sex workers. Deportations of women suspected of sex work becomes a recurring theme in American immigration law, affecting women from many parts of the world, particularly Mexico, China, and eventually Eastern Europe as well. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was sold to the American public as a way to save the American family from the disorderly, unfamilial sexuality of Chinese men. And there were cartoons depicting these so-called opium dens where good white women would be lured in and then corrupted and abused by Chinese men. Of course, Chinese men were living in incredibly impoverished circumstances because they were an oppressed labor group who were desperately trying to raise money to bring back to their families in China, and were at the mercy of really exploitative labor conditions, working on the railroads and in logging camps. But you can see here this sort of extremely upright baby being held out to her hardworking dad with his lunch pail, with "God bless this house" written over the door. So this good Christian family, well-deserving, versus the sort of chaotic Chinese men with their long hair, right, with the sort of symbols of gender disorder, with symbols of all these men sort of lying around on top of one another. By the 1917 Immigration Act, officials deported women of Mexican origin at much higher rates than any other nationality. Between 1910 and 1920, and through these various acts, and it was intensified in 1917, these acts were presumably, and why that's interesting is because these were often called white slavery acts. So in 1910, the Mann Act, or the White Slavery Act, was designed to prevent the sort of transport of a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. And that could mean any number of things. Girls were arrested for going to visit their boyfriends and things like that. But white slavery was the cause, meaning young women from Europe being trafficked to the United States, or young women from the countryside, young white girls from the countryside being trafficked to the city. And yet Mexican women were the group most often deported. So these become ways for government to use sexuality, suspicion of sexuality, to control population flow. And we see right away that it also becomes a way to make decisions about the racial composition of the country, and to treat people differently based on race. And there are many other examples, including the treatment of indigenous North Americans, and so on. But there was protest. There were many efforts to resist this. I've mentioned sex radicals and free speech activists. There were also people like Margaret Sanger, who started out as a sort of socialist radical in New York City. She and others were battling censorship on all fronts. Sanger was a free lover. So part of this for her was she had this sort of feminist free love angle, saying, I want to have all the sex I want to have. And if I'm worried that I'm going to get pregnant, it's not going to be as fun for me. I want to have as much fun as the men are having with this free love, bohemian, Greenwich Village world. And I need contraception for that to happen. And she worried about women who were impoverished, who were struggling to feed their children. She worried about women who were medically fragile, who were continuing to get pregnant because they didn't have ways of stopping their pregnancies. She had a variety of reasons. She's a complicated person. She's not like a simple hero of the story. But she and others began to organize, to collectively organize and build movements. So one of what we now know of as the ACLU, some of its very first cases were about sexual speech. So this ability to talk freely and openly about sex becomes fundamental to this new thing we talk about called civil liberties. And there's a great book by a scholar, Leanne Wheeler, called How Sex Became a Civil Liberty. But no one prior to this point would ever have talked about it that way. Sex is a right. Sex is part of my civil rights. Like, what do you even mean by that? Because the Comstock Act and all these other pieces of legislation start to take rights away from people based on sex, we can start to conceptualize sexual freedom, sexual speech as a right that we want to be able to exercise. And so we got there. But sex remains really important to immigration law. It remains so today. So in the big 1952 McCarran-Walter Immigration Act, which had a lot of different facets to it, there's a new category introduced, a prohibited category for immigration purposes, and that is the psychopathic personality. Now, in psychiatry of the time, a psychopathic personality could mean someone who was schizophrenic, someone who was severely alcoholic and not responsive to treatment. It also was most often used to mean homosexuality. And there's clear evidence in the historical record that the members of Congress who put this language into the McCarran-Walter Act were thinking of that when they added it in. So we have cases of people like Sarah Harb Quiroz, who shows up at the US-Mexico border in the 1950s. Her family is in Mexico, but she performs domestic work in the United States and often travels across the border. And she's stopped because she's wearing trousers and has her hair cut short. So she appears to be queer. And initially she says to the immigration officials, yeah, I sleep with women. Yeah, that's something I do. And she is deported and not allowed to re-enter. So she actually gets a lawyer and brings her case along. That's how we know about her. There probably were so many other people who were deported or not let back in for these reasons, but she decides to fight it. And she, in her final appeal, she gets married to a man and comes back to the immigration officials and say, okay, I learned my lesson. I'm heterosexual now. Please let me back in. And they say, no, you told us you were a lesbian a few years ago. You're a lesbian and you're not allowed. That means that you have a psychopathic personality, which is an excluded category from the US immigration law. So she ultimately loses. I think it's really important when we study the past to remember the people who tried and failed, because it's so much a part of how we build momentum is these significant failures along the way. Okay, so the last part. So this, I hope, helps show why sexual liberation as it came around in the second half of the 20th century was such a radical idea. Some of these ideas might not have been radical if they'd been introduced, earlier, but by 1950, 1960, these were really radical propositions. And the sexual revolution has many forms. There's a new movement for gay civil rights. There's movements for gay liberation. Some activists say, we should do what the civil rights movement is doing and talk about gay people as an oppressed minority who therefore can make a civil rights claim. That's sort of a liberal work within the system, reform the system approach. And there were radicals who said, I don't want any categories. I don't want to put myself in any boxes. I want the government to be completely out of the business of having anything to do with my rights based on my sexuality. So these movements are varied and complicated, but they require tremendous amounts of bravery. Even some of these ones that we might think of as having a more conservative approach, simply to appear in public and identify yourself as gay or lesbian was to risk your job, in your home, and most of your family connections if we're in the 1950s and even much of the 1960s. And in fact, Frank Kameny, who's one of the heroes of the civil rights movement for queer people in the 1960s and 70s, was at times writing to friends that he was so hungry because he had completely run out of food. And so this work required enormous sacrifice. He was a Harvard-trained astronomer who worked for the US Geologic Survey, who was fired because he was gay. Because by the 1940s, 1950s, it was not only illegal to immigrate to the country if you were gay, but it was illegal to be in the federal civil service or in the US military. So this is what they were up against. There are also movements that we can think of as part of sexual liberation that are about people saying nothing about my economic well-being should be determined be premised on my sexual behavior. So women in the welfare rights movement say, stop having social workers show up at my house and do really intrusive interviews about whether I'm sleeping with a man. Stop asking my kids whether there are any men who sleep over in my home, right? I need the support that I'm entitled to. There were movements that reached across racial lines to challenge intimate partner violence. I learned this researching my first book on marriage counseling. You can look in marriage counseling records for decades and never see the phrase domestic violence, but there are descriptions of violence within homes. It's the women's movement of the 1970s that creates a theory of the case that says this is not just this instance here and this instance here. This is a whole culture that says it's okay for husbands to treat their wives this way. We need to treat it systemically. We need to have places for people to go when they're afraid. So, rape crisis centers, shelters for survivors of domestic violence, all of that comes through these movements. And that I think is really, for me, I see that as part of sexual liberation. Part of sexual liberation is saying, I want to do whatever I want to do and say whatever I do sexually. And part of sexual liberation, I argue, is saying, and I want to be safe. I don't want anybody coming in and harming me or telling me what to do with my body. And that my liberation is contingent on that as well. So pleasure becomes a big part of a feminist critique of American sexuality. And one of the main sort of philosophers of this is the great poet Audre Lorde. And she's this famous essay, Uses of the Erotic is Power. And she's urging women, and Black women in particular, to take back their erotic power and to see the possibilities of it as a tool for political liberation. And that it is, that there is incredible power, and that if we let other people take it from us, we will remain oppressed. A person I write about in my book took a very different approach to this, and I get a big kick out of her. Her name's Betty Dodson. She died just a few years ago in her early 90s. She grew up in Wichita, Kansas, had a fairly conventional childhood, but she wanted to be an artist. She started drawing for magazines. She writes about having trouble she borrowed a friend's ring, pretended she was engaged, and so that she could get a prescription for a diaphragm, because only women who were married or maybe engaged could get contraception in the 50s. She'd had an illegal abortion prior to that, and it was a horrendous experience. She wanted to prevent it from happening again, but she was fairly sexually liberated in her personal life. She moves to New York City. She thinks marriage is going to be great. The sex is terrible. And after 6 years, she leaves her husband. But she gets the apartment. And if anybody has ever lived in New York City, you realize that the most important thing to get in a divorce is the apartment. So she gets the apartment, and she keeps painting and doing her art. And she has this really successful 1968 gallery exhibition of these nude figures. A magazine that reprints them gets charged under the Comstock Act for obscenity. That case falls apart. But she, as the Supreme Court is figuring this out, but she decides to basically become full-on focused on sex. And she says, I wanted to be a complete pervert. And so she says this, and she starts getting involved in group sex and all kinds of experimentation. And one of the things she writes about is that she was at these sort of group sex parties, and she sort of took a step back and was like, all these women are faking it. And so she had this realization that many women that she was seeing at these parties were not orgasmic, and were playing along, but weren't in fact having as much fun as the men were. So she becomes truly obsessed with teaching women how to masturbate. And she sees this not just about women having fun, but she literally believes that this is the key to liberation, that autonomous pleasure, a woman's ability to achieve autonomous erotic pleasure, is the key to their liberation, and without which none of these liberations would be possible. So she uses her apartment as a place to run these workshops. She self-publishes a book, Liberating Masturbation, which then sells thousands of copies. If you go to different sort of sex shops, you can still find copies of her books. And she runs these workshops. And so she talks about, these are her drawings, which I think are fabulous. A sex positive woman will have a positive attitude toward herself and the world she lives in. That is the reason I'm almost obsessed these days with the necessity for women to go public. That is, to speak about the importance of female masturbation. In my opinion, it will be our real declaration of independence. It is that revolutionary. And she's not winking as she says that. She means that. She says it over and over again. I want to emphasize she's not a fringe figure in the sex education or feminist sexual liberation movement. She is revered. So Dell Williams, who goes on to found Eve's Garden in New York City, the first female-owned, female-directed sex shop in the country, basically says she was inspired by Betty Dodson. Susie Bright, who's a nationally famous sex educator, talks about Betty Dodson as one of the people who started her career and got her to realize this. If you read letters that people wrote to Dodson or wrote about Dodson, they basically talk about it as almost a conversion experience, that they thought they were frustrated, they couldn't get the information they needed. They went to hear her talk, they went to one of her workshops, and like the scales fell from their eyes, and suddenly they realized this whole world that they had been missing, and that they loved to share. So here she's demonstrating with her Hitachi magic wand at a now convention in 1973. Dodson continues to do this for her entire life. Into her 90s, she continues to host workshops, she continues to lecture, and so on. If you're interested, my favorite moment with her is she goes on Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop show on Netflix. And Paltrow and her co-host are like, oh, we're going to talk about vaginas. And Dodson leans forward and was like, you mean the vulva? And it's so clear that she's so frustrated with these women who don't even know how to name their own anatomy, but think that they're sexually liberated. So she's a wonderful character. She's very problematic in a lot of ways that I talk about in my book. But what I find so fascinating is how controversial this remains. The mood in this room changed when I started talking about her. We don't tend to talk publicly about women's sexual pleasure. And I think that that's part of what's so fascinating and revolutionary about the work that she did and why this history is so important. So we are in the midst of a different kind of revisionist history. The federal government is trying to redefine the human body in ways that are extremely Comstockian. And in fact, the part of the Comstock Act that prohibits interstate commerce in anything related to abortion was never overturned in the courts or by Congress. And it could, in fact, still be invoked. And now, of course, the federal government is trying to define IUDs and other long-acting contraceptives as abortifacients, like the person is having a monthly abortion or something every time they ovulate. So, and that would then be restricted under the Comstock Act as well. This is one of the day one, January 20 executive orders defending women from gender ideology extremism. This thing basically says anything the federal government prints, cross out the word gender, put in the word sex. Gender isn't real, sex is real, and there are only two sexes. So how they think they're going to deal with people who are XO or XXY, I don't know. But because, of course, there are not just two biological sexual categories, but that's what they're doing. And a professor at Texas A&M was just fired because a student stood up and yelled at her that she was teaching gender ideology. The professor had basically said what I just said. And not only that, but the department chair and the dean were also fired when they defended the teacher's academic freedom to speak from her specialty about what she knew. So I'll skip over this. LGBTQ history is being stripped from federal websites and historic sites, or they'll just talk about LGB history, taking out the trans and the queer from the end of the acronym. Entire research projects have been stripped from websites, projects that were huge federal investments in community research. Some of these now survive on other websites, and they've been or saved by scholars. But if you search for them, you won't find them. Even teaching resources like the video about Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus, which was produced by PBS, those have all been taken down. The New York City Public Schools, though, keep it up on their site, so it's still accessible. But if you looked for it at PBS, you search Addie's name. This is part of what makes me sad. It's not just a resource. It's like Addie Brown is being erased. This woman who lived to age 29, she died of tuberculosis. She was buried in an unmarked grave. We only know about her because Rebecca Primus loved her so much. She kept those letters well into a period of time when those sorts of relationships were no longer socially acceptable. And the sort of intentional erasure is not just about, PDFs vanishing. It's about erasing the lives of these really incredible people. So I write about all this in my book, which is over there. I'm happy to talk about it, answer any questions. I also have a newsletter. This is the QR code. The subscription is free. You can get a paid subscription if you want, but you can still get my newsletter if you have a free subscription, and I basically take things happening in the news and write about the history behind them. So my most recent one was about there's a new Heritage Foundation report coming about having a Manhattan Project for babies to try to get the American birth rate up. But they don't mean everyone. They want white people to have many more babies, but they want to marshal the resources of the federal government to raise the birth rate. Manhattan Project for babies, for the birth rate or something like that. So I wrote a little bit about that most recently. But thank you very much. I appreciate all of your time.
Education is so important. And just being able to say the words is so important. So I'm really kudos to you.
Yes.
Hi. So I want to know what do they gain from oppressing everybody's sexuality?
That's a great question. What do they gain? So I think I think about this a lot, and I have to sort of interpret it as best I can. There's no one clear answer. I think that Comstock shows them the incredible power that the federal government can have over populations through sexuality. And this is if you're into French theory, this is a very like Michel Foucault way of thinking about governmentality and biopolitics. But what it means in practice is, for example, with indigenous people, they've tried to basically annihilate Western indigenous populations, and then they decide to do the sort of reservation system. But they also, as they're taking lands away, tribal lands away, the way to get 40 acres is to be a male head of household in a nuclear household. So again, this has to be a marital household where the husband is the primary breadwinner, and then the US government will allow you to have, this bit of land, which in fact was not what most tribal members wanted. They wanted to live on their vast tribal lands. So we see it. So that's the 1887 Dawes Severalty Act. We see it in these immigration laws. We see it in the approach to the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints. I mean, why should Utah's statehood be contingent upon it abolishing polygamy? Right? How is that a measure of whether somebody can be a citizen? Well, it becomes a way to sort of both persecute indigenous nations that practice polygamy and outlaw it there, but also as a way to take power away from the LDS church, which was seen as threateningly powerful, and get them to conform in certain ways to be a more sort of well-behaved state. So particularly, and obviously we're seeing how controlling women's sexuality is an extremely powerful way for the government to try to control populations as well. Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely applies to this administration.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to know that in Delaware, there's still gender studies and women's feminist scholarship. Woo! I wanted to, your presentation reminded me, I must have learned this in some book, or maybe it was in college when I had one like feminist history course. When Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood and all that began, they had a way of dealing with the enforcement. And this is just one story, that sometimes they would have a clinic that straddled the state line, so that when the police came from one state, they just all run over to the other side of the building and they were good. And then another thing that they did, it was not legal to arrest a pregnant woman, so they would get pregnant women to work in the clinic, again, as a way to foil, the enforcement. So just a little, I don't know if you run into anything like that, but a little funny thing.
I wanted to comment that and ask that Comstock emerged after the end of, right after the end of the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment, when there was partial liberation of Black people from slavery, and that I'm wondering if you would think that that might have played a role in some of his enthusiasm and the development of his ideas.
So first part of your question about the Civil War, I skipped over this in my talk this evening, but he had a older brother who fought for the Union and then died. And then so Comstock enlists, and he's sent to Florida, and they see no action. It's just like they think that the fight's going to come to Florida, and it never does. So what do soldiers sitting around for months with nothing to do read? So he's appalled by the scandalous images and literature that the other young soldiers are looking at. And there were, in fact, there were these because of the advent of photography, we think of the Civil War and photography and all of those amazing battlefield scenes that we now have to understand the gravity of the death in the Civil War. There was a lot of porn too. And so little cards with naked figures. There were stereoscopes, which were this new invention where you could two images side by side and you kind of looked through a box and it made them look 3D, which was a really nice way to see a scene of Moscow or Paris or sex. So people made tiny little images they would put on like a watch piece, and then with a magnifying glass, they could, see dirty pictures. So there's pornography everywhere. There are also with the war, the railway system is improved because they need to move equipment and supplies and people quickly to different battle zones. And that, of course, then enables the US mail to move more quickly and all of these printed goods and objects to then also circulate. So there's way more erotica or pornography in circulation by the end of the Civil War than there was before it, a tremendous amount more. And Comstock decides, again, takes it upon himself to move to New York City, that's that gateway to hell, and go after what he sees as all of the sin around him there. Now, your question about this coinciding with the 13th Amendment, that's a brilliant question. I do think there's a lot that we don't know about the sort of the scholarship. I'll answer it this way. What I know is that he hated Jewish people. He hated Eastern European immigrants. So a lot of the people he went after. So Samuel Colgate was on the board that gave money to Comstock. Colgate made Vaseline, which was considered a spermicide and as well as a lubricant. So Comstock didn't go after him. Comstock went after the small proprietors who were very often immigrants and people from Jewish backgrounds or Eastern European backgrounds. Yes. And so, but the question about African-American freedom, and that's a largely unexplored question, and it's a great one.
Well, I project pretty well.
That's for the Zoom.
Oh, excuse me. Okay. Hi. I went to Omega Institute and I got turned on to this book called Pussy, just to say. So there's a woman, I think her name's Renee Tomlinson, something like that. It's a very interesting book about our rights as women to have pleasure and our strength and our anatomy and all that. And have you ever heard of it or no? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Out there.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'll look for it.
So you haven't really talked anything about prostitution, and I I'm actually reading a historical novel now that sort of takes place in the last century. And it's a lot of it, you get, it makes it clear that for many women, they had no option. They could either work as a seamstress, work in a mill, or work in a brothel. And that it seemed also very accepted that men needed this, and that women were, it was accepted as something necessary, as a necessary evil, but it was also the way the women were very powerless, and definitely if they got pregnant, they were in big trouble. And it just seemed like the whole issue of prostitution, it's a lot about women and power, but also women sometimes, now it's often seen as a way of having control over your body when you choose to be a working woman. So it seems like that prostitution is an interesting topic in itself.
Absolutely. It was definitely an economic strategy for a lot of women in the 19th century, moving into the early 20th. One of the other things that Comstock was worried about were these men, youth would get overly excited by corrupt literature and then go outside of marriage to seek sex work and things like this. And that he thought if you got rid of the literature, young men would stop being interested in sex so much. It sort of was his theory of the case. I think it's a poorly supported theory. And so he saw these things as very connected. There's a lot of really interesting work about women using sex work as a strategy. So rag pickers, women who did various kinds of domestic work, who then would occasionally also provide sex work as a way to kind of hold themselves and their families together. There were, and there's an interesting story too by the early 20th century with new zoning laws and sex work being pushed in Chicago, for example. It had been more like in the Loop, and it's pushed into the South Side. And African Americans who've established a foothold in the South Side of Chicago and have professions and have, are getting themselves and their kids higher education are really upset because all of a sudden there's all of this sex work in their neighborhoods, which of course depresses home values and does other kinds of things. It's really, but creating basically zones of illicit sex that are overlain on zones of African-American neighborhoods. And that is a deliberate strategy through zoning policies and through policing decision-making. So we see that happening by the early 20th century as well. It's a fascinating piece of the story. And definitely really important.
To build on comparing to other books, I read a book this summer about women's sexuality in the medieval times. And I thought it was fascinating and very surprising to learn that in the medieval times, they considered women to be highly sexual, like that women were more like animals and they had to be controlled by men, and things like that. And yes. And that's completely opposite the way we think of women now. And I wondered if you could clear up more, like, when did this change? Obviously around the Victorian era, it was really maybe different, but like, how did it go completely the opposite way?
This it's basically something that we see in the second half of the 1800s here, with a push you start seeing, for example, almanacs, which are one of the most common, popular, affordable publications in the time, had like poems about these really horny wives and widows going after lots of men, and really kind of ribald poetry and stories and so on. Those start to be printed less often. And you see more of the jokes being about sexually assertive men, so that the model becomes more the sort of male entitlement to access to women. So I write about this sort of the democratization of white men's entitlement to women. It had been like, say, 1700, you had to be an elite white man for people to consider you somebody who should be able to do what he wants. And part of the democracy project of the United States is also, if you think by the 1820s and 30s, more white men can vote, but it's also about teaching white men that they also are entitled to have the sex that they want to have with the people they want to have it with. So women lose power through that transformation. The sort of folk understandings of women as the more lustful of the sexes is replaced by a early national ideology of the virtuous wife and mother. So you can justify, so white women can't vote, but that's because they're so virtuous. Their purity is what will raise their children to become good citizens of the republic, right? So these ideologies kind of, there's lots of reasons, but they kind of overlap to then produce this idea of the passionless white woman. At the same time, all of that theory of lust and sexual disorder is thrown onto women of color. And so this idea that there are women who are just incredibly sexually assertive and available becomes part of the underlying logic of American slavery and a justification for truly awful treatment of Black women and other women. And you can see it in the deportations of Mexican women, right? That somehow they are sexually, they're not pure, they're not virtuous, they are a different kind of woman. That happens too.
Thank you. 48 years ago, in this September, I was one of the first doctoral students at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education in their human sexuality education major. And I remember meeting some of the Kinsey team and Masters and Johnson and so forth. But what I wanted to mention was there was an author by the name of Michel Foucault, who wrote The History of Sexuality. And Foucault raises a number of issues with the hypothesis of repression. We've repressed sexuality since the 17th century and only recently liberated it. His concern is that it's all of a piece, that the liberation can be just as bad as the repression in some ways. It's always putting people in boxes. It's always painting conceptual constructs around them. Sorry about that. An example would be an example from today is kind of on my mind. When you think about concepts and how thinking works, concepts are ways of shorthanding information so that you can quickly get to one point to another. What we're seeing right now in the movements of liberation are working with those concepts in different ways that have never been worked with before, like this. Give an example, a concept of a chair. A chair is well, you're sitting on a chair right now. It's got 4 legs, it's got a seat. When you walk into a room, you say, oh, that's a chair. I know how to work with that. I know what to do with that. It's to sit on. There's no having to refigure what that means. The new sexual concepts that are coming out today force one to stop in the middle of one's thought and say, this is a different kind of person, a different kind of sexuality, a different kind of whatever. And it causes many people difficulty. But this may be an interesting way to break through that's never been tried before at a conceptual level. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. One of the themes that comes up again is the importance of language and the sort of ability to give a name to something and how both either oppressive or transformational, liberatory that can be. So having a phrase like gay rights or gay power becomes a way for people who might not have seen themselves as having a common cause to form a movement. It also is a rejection of the word so gay liberation rejects the word homosexual. They say that's a word that sexologists and doctors put on us. We reject that. We're, gay and proud. So words are important. I get the question a lot of like, why are there so many more transgender people now than there were before rather? And I think that we've had the word a very brief period of time. And I always see variation when I look at the history. So I think that we're seeing people respond to a word that gives a name to something they maybe didn't have a name for before, and also respond to what I would argue is the inherent weirdness of gender. This idea that gender is sort of simple and binary is bizarre when you think about how varied and interesting people really are. And I think some of what we're seeing is young people kind of take an idea and run with it and sort of explore gender in ways that are unfamiliar to those of us who didn't grow up with that word in common parlance. But that's important, I think. The word gender fluid. Yeah, yeah.
I am interested in your take on more recent history and the debate within the feminist community around pornography and the rise of social media and our relationship to ourselves because of it, and how it has, polarized, I think, the feminist community and in some ways. Like there's people like Andrea Dworkin who is very anti, and then there's others that feel like it's empowering, and others that feel like it's oppressive. And obviously it all comes out of a kind of civil rights, beware of what you wish for in terms of liberation, as the gentleman over there was saying. Anyway, I just would like to hear what your take is.
It's a big question that I've written about and thought about. So I want to see if I can sort of say this succinctly. It becomes in the 70s, there's this split among feminists between groups that describe themselves as either anti-porn or pro-sex. And in the pro-sex group are more queer women, are more women who are who practice kink or BDSM. And some of them are then being, these other feminists are saying, you're just recreating patriarchy. If you're role-playing power, you're role-playing patriarchy, and that's what we just are fighting against. And they see kink and role-playing as, in fact, an anti-feminist practice. And those lines become the foundation for the anti-porn versus pro-sex. They don't call themselves pro-porn, but they say they're pro-sex. And basically they say, we didn't fight this revolution just for other women to tell us how to use our bodies and what our pleasure should look like, and argue that all sex is about power. And if we're role-playing it, we're acknowledging that it's about power. The erotic is connected to power. And the anti-porn feminists align with Phyllis Schlafly and are involved in helping the Meese Commission, Edwin Meese's Anti-Pornography Commission, write its report by 1986. It's more complicated than that. There's a whole debate now over age verification strategies for pornography sites. A number of states have passed laws. And there are a number of practical reasons why I personally don't think those are good ideas. One is that it'll put places that have put safety measures, like Pornhub has tried to put some safety measures in place in response to not doing it and getting in trouble for not doing that. So if Pornhub has these age verification rules, they will go out of business, and they're no longer in those states. Places that have no guardrails at all are the sites that will become available. There's no way to eliminate pornography. There just isn't a way to do it. The other thing that history shows us is the first places that are shut down and the first people who are arrested are gay. And whenever cities have anti-pornography crackdowns, it is, and it's not necessarily gay pornogaphy, it's theaters showing queer-themed movies. Right? And that gets defined as obscene, because what is obscene? What is pornography? It's an amorphous idea. So those of us who are worried about violence against women, who are worried about young women being trafficked, who are worried about our children seeing graphic, often violent sex, we have to be careful to think about how these things often play out, right? And so I'm very hesitant to support those measures. The other thing is that this is happening as states are systematically taking sex education out of their schools. So young people sort of have nowhere to go to find a lot of sexual information. So there's a countervailing argument, which is that we should have more women-produced feminist pornography, that we should have, we should make it possible for people who are adult film actors to be paid a living wage and to have safe working conditions so that they can positively, in ways that they prefer, produce this content. There is no way to get rid of pornography from society. It's been tried and it has never worked. And I fear that when we put those kinds of laws into place, people end up going into much riskier forms of employment, because the people still need the work who do the work. And there's still a lot of money to be made from putting it out there. So it doesn't actually, just like with the Comstock Act, like it didn't get rid of pornography, the Comstock Act, it just pushed it underground. Like prohibition. I mean, these are tricky issues. No, Comstock was not a hypocrite. He didn't have any fun at all, as far as anyone could tell.
All the ideas that were said remind me of this book I read by Sally Tisdale, Talk Dirty to Me. It's an informal history of pornography through anecdotes. And she's actually, her background is a nurse. And so some of her anecdotes are like, oh my God, they're very interesting. I mean, I've read the book like twice already. You know, I mean, it's like, it's a wonderful book, but it's, yeah, Talk Dirty to Me. She explains that. If you want to read, I won't say it. She explains why she got the title Talk Dirty to Me, you know, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think we have to wrap up. It's just about 9, almost 9 o'clock. And there's books over there. I think there's some people have been looking at the books. You can explain to them how they can.
Sure. The books are $35. There's a QR code to Venmo that to me, or you could pay me cash. I'm happy to sign your book for you if you'd like. And thank you again for having me here. This has been a wonderful experience.